Welcome to a coffee break discussion. We are talking today about freedom of disinformation. Should the media be on a tighter leash? My name is Marta de Choc. I teach at the Universities of Western Ontario, and I'm a fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. This term, I have the pleasure of being a visiting fellow at the Kiev Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. And we have assembled a very interesting panel for you, a selection of journalists, experts, analysts, and academics to look at this issue that really has been on everybody's mind. We will start, I'll start with just laying out what I consider some of the key issues, and then I'll turn the floor over to our distinguished panelists. Freedom of speech. This is the founding freedom that is the basis of all other freedoms, according to the United Nations Declaration of Independence of Human Rights, as everybody knows. But freedom of speech, I think, and I'm going to just sit a little back so that we can see each other rather than, freedom of speech, it's an ideal. I'd like to make 3 points and then turn it over to the rest of you. I'd like to set the baseline with perhaps a statement that you may agree or disagree with. Freedom of speech, it's enshrined in a lot of constitutions. It's one of our fundamental beliefs, but it's something that doesn't really exist in any country. I would suggest it's an ideal that we strive for in democracies. And threats to freedom of speech come from both the state and the corporate world. And this is something that we see during times of peace, and I think Ukraine is a really nice example of this. If we look at what the situation was in the summer of 2013, there was actually relatively little free speech in Ukraine because of both state and corporate censorship. And initiatives like Громадське телебачення, Громадське радіо were a response to that. So the goal of freedom of speech is something that societies strive towards rather than something that exists during peacetime. So I'd start with that as the first point. What happens when war comes? And this is what happened to Ukraine in the spring of 2014. So we go from a situation where there's pressures on freedom of speech to information becomes weaponized, and it becomes part of the arsenal of an aggressor state that is not only perpetrating military actions, but also using information to deliberately distort what's happening and use that as a way of destabilizing society and clouding international public opinion on the event. What was Ukraine's response to this? Well, there were a lot of discussions, both among journalists, and I think our journalist friend will speak to that, also among policy circles. And the question that our panel is about is, should freedom of speech be restricted, is a policy decision that the Ukrainian government made in the summer of 2014 to limit what they called assault of disinformation coming at them. The state broadcasting agency, Національна рада з питань телебачення і радіомовлення, they decided to block Russian television channels from being broadcast into Ukraine. This was very controversial. Some people supported that, some people opposed it. My question is, how effective has that been? Because in this era of global communication systems, if you want to watch Russian television, you can watch it online and nobody can block the internet. So it was a policy that, on the one hand, I thought was understandable, but was it ultimately effective? And should that have been done? What other options were available? A second policy decision that the Ukrainian government made that also was quite controversial is they created a Ministry of Information Policy. And the idea was to have some sort of state coherence in fighting against this disinformation war. That we are being attacked, we need a ministry to formulate policy. Ukrainian journalists have called this the Ministry of Propaganda and have been quite critical of that instrument. And again, the question is, how effective has that instrument been? So that's perhaps something that each of you could speak about. So that's just what I wanted to start with. And I'd like to turn over the floor. Perhaps I can introduce you as we go along. Mr. Ben Nemo is a freelance analyst, former NATO press officer for Russia and Ukraine. And now that he's no longer bound by the rules of NATO, he can express his views openly.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the thoughts. I think what you say about freedom of speech being the ideal is crucial, and putting it in the context of the political and the business corporate side is vital, because the way I would come at this in terms of the question, what do you do should the media be reined in, there are two fundamental principles we need to look at. One is that there are people of ill will out there who will pose as journalists to try and undermine our societies. And we know that, and particularly in Ukraine, we've seen that, and that is a danger to the state. However, there are politicians of ill will or of self-will who can cause far more damage and will be able to cause far more damage if there aren't people there who act as the watchdog. And in a lot of the cases, that is the media. And the problem we are facing is, how do you deal with the so-called journalists of ill will without empowering the politicians of ill will? And for me, that's the problem you're looking at. It would be easy to say, let's just ban all the media that are putting out propaganda, so then define propaganda. Propaganda is a word I try never ever to use, because it boils down to mean saying something which I don't like. And so often when you do a Google search for propaganda, so often it will boil down to, my opponent is using propaganda against me because he's saying that I'm wrong. If you're going to take that attitude, then nobody will be able to say anything, and whoever's in power at the time will have total control over the media. In the same way, if you say, well, all these evil journalists are under the authority of a foreign power, therefore they are foreign agents, let's register them as foreign agents. Well, we've seen where that's been done. And I wouldn't say that actually the media scene and public information in Russia has benefited as a result. So the balance that we need to find is between dealing with the pseudo-journalists without setting up a situation in which politicians of ill will in our own countries can then abuse it. And I think there are a couple of ways you can look at doing that. Because in general, if you look at the disinformation which is being spread, the problem is not that it's Russian disinformation. The problem is that it's disinformation, it's lies, it's false. And one way to approach this for me as a former journalist would be to say, well, in what way is this product breaching journalistic standards? There are basic standards that we all have to follow, or we all meant to follow as journalists, showing balance in our reporting, separating out opinion from facts, very important one, actually getting our facts right, attributing correctly. These are things which have been regularly and blatantly abused by the Kremlin media, both in Russian and in English, since the conflict. And those are the tools which they are then using to commit their propaganda. So, for example, last week, there was a case of the Russian media running a story quoting a French journalist from Radio Free Europe on an interview that she'd never actually done. And so I think she ended up writing in Politico saying, well, this is how the propaganda machine used me. Yeah? That is, yes, that's propaganda, but it's also a blatant breach of journalistic standards. So I'm putting this idea out there. Is one way to approach it to say, well, here are the basic criteria by which journalists should live. You don't make up interviews. That's fairly standard. You make sure that you separate out opinion from fact. And it's a tough thing to swallow, but if, given that we're sitting in Riga, if in an opinion piece, RT or Sputnik say, as an officially labelled opinion piece, well, Latvia is a country entirely made up of fascists. If they're labelling that as an opinion, I would argue that there's not actually much, A, that you can do about it, or B, that you should do about it, if that is labelled as an opinion. If there is a line in a standard news piece saying, Latvia is a country of fascists, without attributing it to somebody. They're just reporting that as a fact. That is a failure to separate fact from opinion. That is a failure of journalistic standards, and that needs to be dealt with. The question is how you then enforce that.
Precisely.
And again, something which occurred to me, and this is merely an idea I'm putting out there, you wouldn't want to have that in the hands of national regulators if they have anything to do with government, because then you have the worst scenario, which is government can say, well, I think that's wrong because you're not giving me enough airtime, so I'm shutting you down. I wonder, is this something where you could have, certainly within Europe, could you have an EU level approach? Can you have an EU Charter of Journalism which is monitored by the Commission? You need to worry about the impact on the Commission then, but at least you are getting away from the problem of local journalists and local politicians intervening in their own in their own markets. Another thing, another way to approach it would be a much more grassroots approach. And given that this is a concern, can you work through universities and journalism schools and teach people, A, these are the standards to which you should aspire, and B, this is what your chance will be of getting another job if you violate those standards. I work a lot on RT and Sputnik, for example, and I would find it very hard to name any RT anchor who has gone on to work for another rather more reputable TV agency, because they are not viewed as a credible and professional news firm. They're great entertainment, but they're not news. So to discuss with journalism students, you can get paid lots of money to RT, to go and work for RT, but then what are your chances of getting a real job afterwards? You are tarnishing yourself by the association. So another way you can do it is to look at what is the effect on the people who work there in terms of their career. If you are moving into something which is seen as a propaganda field, you can make a great career as a lobbyist or a propagandist, but you're not going to be a journalist. Is that what you want? So there are two different ways you can go at this, but the bottom line for me is that as soon as you start talking about it as propaganda, you are in trouble and you are on the slippery slope. There need to be very definite criteria by which you measure, is this piece of so-called news acceptable or not? And so to come to the Ukrainian question, I don't know enough about the individual cases of the individual broadcasters, but what I would want to see would be chapter and verse of, on this day with this broadcast, what they were saying with this, or this series of broadcasts has been blatantly biased because you've had 75 minutes of airtime of the opposition and 3 seconds of the government. But whatever you're going to do, you need to have very, very definite criteria to which you are holding people, because otherwise you are just going to be accused of muzzling the free press because that's your opinion.
Thank you. Excuse me, thank you. You raised a lot of wonderful points. My question to you, which I'll just put on the table because I'd like to get to the other speakers, is you speak in the ideal. Absolutely, students should be taught journalistic standards, but I think the question really is, what do you do if those journalistic standards are not being met deliberately, and your fear is that those false reports are having an impact on public opinion in your country or international public opinion? So I think that's sort of the question, not how to train journalists how to work according to the standards that we all recognize, but what to do if that's not working, and how do you defend yourself, as it were, if you're Ukraine and you feel that this barrage is coming at you. So that's perhaps something to pick up in the next round. Our next speaker,
let's go for the next speaker.
Sorry,
we could talk about this a lot. So.
I should stick to the format here. I just love engaging in conversation. Our next speaker is from Russia. Dr. Sergei Utkin is the head of the Department of Strategic Assessment at the Center for Situation Analysis at the Russian Academy of Sciences. So you're coming from the perspective of a country that is being accused of this propaganda. So perhaps the way to pose the question to you would be, how do you think the Russian government would respond if it was on the receiving end of this type of propaganda, or what is being labeled an information war? If they were on the receiving end, what do you think the Russian government would do? How does one fight against it?
It's very hard to imagine Russia in precisely the same situation where Ukraine is, and here we get back to the point that was raised during this conference many times, that It's pretty much about the state of affairs you have in the government. If you have bad governance in all senses, and what's even more important, weak governance, then you may get in this type of situation. If you don't have this trouble, it's harder to get in this kind of situation. And Russia has lots of downsides in the state of its political affairs, and lots of problems, but this is a different kind of problems. And definitely, if the Russian government sees a threat for it coming from the information campaign, they have tools to deal with that, because the majority of the Russian population, they watch Russian federal TV, and I mean not just the Russian TV in general, but the 2-3 most widely spread TV channels. That means if you control these channels, you have the upper hand. You may have all sorts of media campaigns around, but for your citizens, what matters is what's in these federal TV channels, and you are pretty much safe if you have this system in your disposal, and the system is already in the governmental disposal. You do understand that if a person is developed enough to use the internet to read newspapers, then an opinion different from the one of the government is just one click away from you. But if a person just relies on TV completely, as some people do, then and quite a lot of people do, then the government feels safe. So it's my vision is actually that it's not that much about blocking or non-blocking news source. It's much more the problem of the audience, why the audience is perceptive to this kind of propaganda campaigns, and can you do something about that? We actually have trouble which is probably wider than just the Ukraine crisis and the Russian-Ukrainian relations. We have trouble with the TV in general becoming more and more outdated. It's if you just look at what kind of stuff they broadcast, and I mean there are exceptions in this sense. Hromadske TV, for example, it's more like aimed at advanced audiences, people who rather use the internet than the regular TV. But the regular TV is aimed at aged persons, persons who are very often lazy to look for other sources of information, and that makes them easy to manipulate. So it's the question you should ask yourself, how you work with your population who is this kind of people, who is lazy, who are not willing to look for other sources of information, and who prefer the information just in the language they know, and just from the sources they got used to. Can you get them got used to other sources? This is the question, and it's of course not easy to make these people change their behavior.
So you think Russia is safe from any propaganda war, that perhaps the United States could launch a major information campaign in Russian in sophisticated ways to try to convince the population to overthrow Putin? Well, they are bulletproof because they control the TV channels.
I think the Russian government can feel absolutely safe about this. That there are other sources of anxiety probably, but you know, there was a funny case when the State Department launched a Twitter account, Progress for Ukraine, I think that was the name, and they tried to create a number of very simplistic, almost to the level of caricature materials with bright slogans, short slogans, just for wider audience, and that was just laughed over on the Russian internet, even among among the people who were sympathetic to Ukraine in the course of the crisis. They were seeing this and saying, oh, well, do they think we are just that dumb to buy this? So if you just launch a campaign from the outside and address it to the society, which is actually closed society, so it lives on the sources it creates itself, information sources, I mean the sources that are stirred by the government, you don't achieve the result.
I see your hand going up, but this is, I see, a natural bridge to a speaker. I'm going to slightly change the order because what your last comments suggest that external propaganda will not be effective in Russia. But there's always the possibility of internal movements, and this is precisely what Hromadske television is about. It's a grassroots TV project that started in response to pressures from a corrupt president and a very powerful corporate media system that actually has been challenging the status quo, both during the Yanukovych regime, during the Euromaidan protests, and into the present. So I would like to now give the word to Mr. Maxim Eristavi, who is one of the co-founders of Hromadske television and Hromadske International.
Yes.
And get your thoughts on should media be on a tighter leash.
Thank you so much again. Actually, I think that what I do, what my colleagues do every day is having this everyday experience being on a battleground when it comes to informational wars. And it's something that is very challenging for you as a professional because you have to deal with such complex issue every day and make your decisions and make your calls every day. But I think that in the last year I've learned three things that are very, could be maybe helpful for this conversation. The first one is about nature of propaganda, and Russian propaganda is not designed to convince people. What it does instead is destroys the middle ground for any kind of conversation in the middle or debate. So when it's supported by a number, by the way, very interesting studies where people would actually compare data, voting data in those regions that are affected by propaganda. What they see there is those people who already have pro-Western views, they became more extreme in their views, and those people who had pro-Russian views, they became more extreme for pro-Russian views, and then there is no middle ground. And if there is no middle ground, no debate is happening, then there is a fertile soil for any kind of political manipulation that you can actually do. And this is a very important point about that, the access to true information or truth. It's not the case often because, for example, in Russia has one of the highest level of access to internet in Europe. 77% have an access, on a weekly basis to internet. Russia is not North Korea. There is no wall banning all websites. Even in Russian, they have access to BBC, Russian Radio Liberty. They have access to Hromadske in Russian. So there is an access to information. The problem is that people don't want to read that or access that information because of polarization they're not interested in. So by designing some kind of structures of counter-propaganda or structures that specifically designed around combating propaganda is wrong because it will be fruitless and it will not lead to actual effect. And what we should do instead is to invest in good, high-quality, independent journalism because media polarization in this region will not be forever. At some point, because of economy issues or social issues in those societies that are deeply affected by propaganda, they will come back to the point of self-reflection and start asking questions why it's getting wrong or why our government is bad at some things. And then when they will be open finally to this self-reflection point, they will reach out to independent news media, and though that vast data, that vast amount of data when it comes to investigative journalism or stories should be there accessible for them by that time. And the third point, I think, which is extremely important, is the longer the fight, the more you become like your enemy. And it's something that we're dealing right now in Ukraine, in Baltic states, and all around the region, where people, and I've been working in Russian newsrooms, and I've been working for Russian state news agency for some time. The most surprising thing that when I saw the rising power of propaganda and the state level pressure on journalists, I would be surprised how many issues of self-censorship I would encounter first. So the message wouldn't come from the top to the bottom, but actually many Russian journalists would start asking questions. Well, should we profile this issue because it kind of hurts the image of Russia and it's not very patriotic and, you know, it's even treasonous and we have to support Russia. A year after the war in eastern Ukraine, I would see, unfortunately, some really disturbing tendencies inside Ukrainian newsrooms where journalists being affected by Russian propaganda, traumatized, and being, actors in this whole battle, they would be a bit paranoid, and they would think much more about should they or should they not cover specific issues. So, for example, if we have issues that are undercovered, like, for example, far-right forces or rising violence against the LGBT community in Ukraine, journalists would also ask, well, it's an important issue, but if I report this issue and make it public and make a discussion of it, Russia would say that, well, it's a Nazi state without no democracy, so Russia would use it as a weapon against us. So maybe it's not a good idea to cover it. And then you have the self-censorship issues in the newsroom. You have still very profound effect of oligarchs over media landscape in Ukraine. And you have the state that actually thinks still in very Soviet terms of how to control information. And you were right. If I don't like this, I will ban this because I don't like it. And I understand the issue of national interests or even defense issues, that if you're onslaught, if you're, basically should battle the amount of propaganda, lies, fabrication from the other side, how do you respond? And basically it's for them easier to ban everything. But at the same time, I'm not personally comfortable with the idea that in post-Soviet societies where democracy is not strong enough for the state to be involved in very subjective decision-making on media issues. So I'm not very comfortable with any official making that call. What kind of information is propaganda? What kind of information is just critical thinking? So we have a lot of issues inside Ukraine where officials are not embarrassed to say, like, this is not right to criticize corruption inside the army because army is in the active state of war. So those people who do that, they could be responsible, and there are actually legislative initiatives which are absolutely insane and very dangerous. The Ministry of Information you told about. That's something Hromadske Network was opposed from the start because it's basically a Soviet relic product of Soviet thinking, that you can create some kind of vertical and disseminate the message from the top to the bottom. Those things are very hurtful. Those things are very Russian-like, and we should talk about that where's the balance between nurturing media freedoms, freedom of speech in those developing countries, and protecting yourself from misinformation. And I think the only answer is to invest in independent journalism, and so the information would be available for people when they suddenly will decide to reach out for it.
Thank you. You raised a lot of very good points. Long-term investment, quality journalism as a way of combating propaganda, but that long-term versus short-term goals is, I think, an issue. And our next speaker, Mr. Vasyl Miroshnichenko, is one of the co-founders of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which is an initiative that was a really fast response to the situation where Ukraine suddenly found itself being subjected to an information war, and the state wasn't able to actually do anything about it. So Mr. Miroshnichenko and others created this Crisis Media Center, which became a platform for politicians, for civil society groups and others to present their views as perhaps a way of a positive way of fighting against the information war. So perhaps I would be very interested to hear your views on how does one fight against the propaganda, against a propaganda war, by limiting, by opening, by perhaps others?
I think it's very simple in a way, because simple and complicated at the same time, because all you need to do, you need to deliver the truth. So you need to create channels of communication, and that's the reason why we saw those little green men in Crimea in early March of last year. We set up the operation. It was rolled out in 48 hours. We actually got a great team of people. We all knew how international media works, so we knew what was most important. So what was most important? It was actually to make sure that Ukraine has been heard. We work as a B2B operation. We only work with international journalists. Now we, of course, cater to journalists in Ukraine as well. But we are only, so we're pretty much a news agency in a way. That's part of our operation. But we are targeting them in different languages. We target them in English. We have an operation, of course, in Russian and Ukrainian. But we now do weekly briefs in French, German, and Spanish. A little bit of in Chinese and other languages as well, as much as we can do. But I think it's very important so that international journalists get first-hand information from the anti-terrorist, on the anti-terrorist operation, on the developments in the military area, as well as in other topics which might be of interest, such as economic reforms, fighting corruption, and other aspects of Ukraine's politics and business, and et cetera, et cetera. So we were there, and we do believe that we are also contributing to enhancing the communication capabilities of our government departments, and this is one of our key areas of focus at the moment. We work with different ministries. We work with the Office of the President. We are actually there transferring the skills which exist in the private sector, because I come from business, and my business is strategic communications business. And unfortunately, in our government departments, people had no idea of how new media works, how actually international journalists work. The problem is most of the people don't even speak any foreign language in those departments. That's the problem. And now all of a sudden, when we are in a time of war, we have to communicate. The problem is, our foreign service was not prepared for that war. I know plenty of examples where Ukrainian ambassadors abroad would shy away from television because they were not used to speaking to television. And I have plenty of cases and names of people who ignored top TV shows on BBC One, or let's say, or any other international channel in the morning on Sunday, because they just thought, firstly, well, it's Sunday, I'm on vacation. Secondly, they were not comfortable on television. Thirdly, sometimes they don't speak the language of the country where they stay, and that's the problem. So we have to overhaul the whole system of Ministry of Foreign Affairs within the country, as well as the whole communications capabilities of the government. So we are contributing to that. I want to reflect on some of the issues you raised at the beginning on the freedom of speech. Yes, maybe we don't yet complete freedom of speech in Ukraine, but we do have plurality of opinions, which are guaranteed by the availability of various media holdings owned by oligarchs, as you know. So basically, yeah, they have different opinions, they have different relationship with the Prime Minister or the President, and they have different ambitions. So you get these different opinions aired by those TV channels of the oligarchs. Talking on the Ministry of Information, if I were the President of Ukraine, I would never create a Ministry of Information.
Information policy.
Information policy, okay. Thank you for making that correction. But at the same time, what I would do, I would actually invest resources into the reform of the national state-owned television. That's right. I would actually make sure that the public TV is actually launched. Ukraine has been working on this public television for the past 12 years. And they didn't create it. It's not even there yet. Well, finally, they have a roadmap, but it's not there yet. So it's very simple. Look, nobody's actually even watching national state TV on channel. Their ratings have gone down.
I watch it.
But the ratings have gone down. If you look at the times of Yanukovych, they were higher. Now they're down. So give me a break. What's going on? Can you change the management? Get new people who actually know how television works. Create good content. People don't watch it because it's not interesting. So now, speaking of propaganda, why propaganda? Look, there is propaganda within Russia, there is Russian propaganda in Ukraine, there is international propaganda, which Russia is, and it's disinformation primarily, which Russia is doing. So totally different channels of communications and different purposes. You have to keep this in mind. So why Russian propaganda now works in many territories of Ukraine who have access. Now, I do believe that it was good to actually shut down all the Russian broadcasting in Ukraine. That's my point. That's the reason why Russians shut down all Ukrainian television in Crimea the minute they started their war there. And therefore, and it succeeded because they shut it down. Okay, so that's of course there is a thin line there on the freedom of speech and everything, but in the security situation that Ukraine were, it was the right decision. Now, why it works? Because Russian media is very sophisticated. They are very developed, and they actually know how it works. It's very emotional. It's very psychological. So people feel that they're part of the story. They're part of that crucified boy. They're part of those elderly people. They're part of those World War II veterans who were humiliated by the Nazi junta. They bring tears to the eyes of the viewers. It's a totally different concept. Once you watch it, you just cannot agree with that because it's there, so deep. Look, my grandfather, I mean, I quote this story every time. He's a World War II veteran, 89, lives in Ternopil, but he's a communist, and he reads communist newspapers. And he does believe that Putin is protecting himself. He is convinced of that. Look, Daesh, or ISIS, what they do, the same thing. It's very similar. The disinformation that Russia is doing is similar to ISIS. I'll give you one example. So you instill fear. All the enemies will be punished. So they cut off their hats, they film it, and they show it to people. Then they come back and they actually rebuild hospitals, they rebuild infrastructure and say, look, we are actually there to change it. So Russians are terrifying Russian people. Look what this atrocity is going on there about this Nazi fascist junta. But you know what? We are there to protect those Russian speakers because Russian speakers are under threat. And you see, it works very easily because, you know, for any Russian speaker watching this, like, wow, why are they attacking Russian speakers in Ukraine? Why do they eat those people for breakfast in the morning? This is so gross. But it works, you know, and it works. People buy into that because it's emotional. It's very simple. And you know, there was one Russian I had a conversation recently with. I just quote her before we go on with the discussion. And she's like very progressive, and we met in Stockholm. And I'm like, hey, what's going on in Russia? I mean, and she's like, oh, you know, I consider myself this, you know, anti-Putin, and I was really against the annexation of Crimea. And she's married to somebody from Brazil, lives in Brazil and Moscow. And then she says the following thing, but you know what? It's like we Russians, we've never respected ourselves. And now finally, after May 9th of this year, May 9th is the day when they celebrate their victory in the Second World War. And we all celebrate it, but it's a different way, of course. And now, only after that date, this year, that we've started respecting ourselves.
Because, why?
Yeah, that was my question. So why? So you never had respect towards yourselves? No, it's just, you know, we finally realized that we need to be respected. And it just came upon us, and all the people of Russia now respect ourselves, and we are there, you know, just protecting our interests. And it was so bizarre to me.
Dissonance.
Yeah, and I was like, you know what, I'm in communications business, I really know how it works, I know how television works and why you are having this feeling. And she said, no, you've been brainwashed by this Ukrainian television. And yeah, and that was the end of the conversation. And I was like, hey, you just said that you were like anti-Putin and you were against annexation of Crimea. But at the end of the day, she is buying into that whole thing.
Responding, yes. Thank you. You have all raised very interesting questions. Journalistic standards, audiences in Russia, control of the system, investing in independent journalism long-term, the emotional impact. I'd like to give you a chance to respond to each other's comments if you like, and then I have some more questions for you. So shall we?
Can I respond to your comment about education?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's very important. What I've seen in the region, and obviously there is a lack of education or understanding, but you've raised 2 points that, for example, self-regulating inside professional community, well, it's not working very well because, for example, all those journalists, foreign journalists that work in Russia involved in propaganda lies, they don't care about coming back and working for established institutions because in the midst of cuts and firings back in the States, it's not possible for you to get a job. And if you get a job, it's so underpaid that it doesn't make any sense. So, but they come to Moscow and they've been offered contracts, thousands and thousands of dollars, and the only thing they have to do is lying, and most of them, they don't care about that because they know for sure that they will never come back there because there are no jobs there. They can switch to China, to other state-run and very wealthy broadcasters. So this thing is not, working as it should be. So the other education thing, I think what I've seen in Ukraine, for example, Ukraine was a terrific example of how many funds and grant money were spent on education of journalists, despite state pressure, despite oligarch control. Almost every journalist would have an access to some kind of international program raising standards. But it didn't work in a way that the moment the revolution started, the moment the war started, many people were throwing out all journalistic standards and going for media weapons instead, using that. So I think that in that case, it's not like you can do much, but maybe we should ask questions about the quality of our international educational programs, and maybe in our case, we were thinking of not just going for workshops or just sending people to do trainings, but maybe actually to connect journalists between countries more, because it's much more helpful. In the last year, so many journalists came to Ukraine and they got in touch with local journalists. Local journalists learned a lot, and foreign journalists learned a lot. And I think it was much more helpful in 1 year than 2 decades of constant workshops and trainings.
You raised a really good point about international political economy of the media. And as I was listening to your comments, I think it's important not to idealize standards in other countries, because what I started with, these standards, they're shaky everywhere. And if one was to look at the behavior of journalists in the United States or in Germany
Yes.
or Britain during times of crisis and war, you would see a lot of violation of journalistic integrity and standards, and also the corporate pressures. So I think putting Ukrainian and Russian journalists in a global comparison is always something to keep in mind. But Dr. Utkin had a comment.
Just to add to that, I think the trouble is not that much with the standards, but with the policy, the Russian policy, and the characteristics of the Russian system, political system. I mean, if we speak about this state-controlled media, this should not be the case. I mean, if we have various sources of financing of the media, and if you have the society based on the rule of law, so that people who do control the media other than the state media, they are aware that if they have an independent line, they will not be punished, that they will keep their properties in their disposal. Then this creates a competitive environment, and this creates a demand for this public TV that we talked about. I mean, it was pretty much the first thing people started to think about in post-Soviet Russia, to make this kind of TV, and this failed. And we keep failing with that. And actually, even in developed democracies, you have lots of critics towards the practices, even of the BBC, which is gold standard. In Germany, there are people who say that ZDF is kind of too pro-Merkel, too pro-governmental. So it's never easy, but when you have the competitive environment, you are already halfway there. This is what needs to be changed. It's not the standards themselves. It's the system that should work properly, and the policy thing. I mean, well, imagine a democratic country, the US, that has military capabilities and that decides to go into Iraq war. Do you have like all the media protesting against that and saying, oh, well, this is crazy decision, we should not do that? Not really. There are lots of people who for various reasons support the government, and not always because they really think so. They think, oh, well, this is the line of the government, government, and I will support it, and probably I'll get back something in return for that, for my support that I provide for the government. This is the foundation of this self-censorship that you talked about. So it's not the problem that Russia has all those TV channels. The problem is the decision taken by the leadership of a country of 140 million people to have this kind of radical policy towards its neighbor. If this is the decision by leadership of this powerful country, you have the trouble already. What kind of media they have? That's a secondary question.
Thank you. Ben Nemo?
I had a comment and a question. The question is for Maxim. You said that we need to invest in independent journalism, which I think is absolutely right. The more that can be invested in independent quality journalism, the better. But who does the investing?
That's a good question.
And then how are they independent? Because you need to have that firewall between the guy who writes the check and the guy who writes the story. Because if you don't have that, then they're not quality independent media. You've just created another dependent factor. So my question would be, how do you protect that? Coming back to the idea of standards, the reason I think standards are so important is that they are the closest thing we have in journalism to objective criteria. You can ask, is that propaganda? Well, it's an endless question. You can ask, is this news broadcaster a menace to the state? It's an open question. You can argue it either ways. You can ask, was that journalist broadcast, is that fact as presented by that journalist accurate? Well, you can prove is it or not. If a news agency says that journalist X has done an interview with President Y, and then it turns out that President Y never gave that interview and the whole thing is being made up, that is, it's a small thing, but it's an objective thing which you can prove, and therefore that gives you a channel in which is not giving carte blanche to anyone to say, I'm going to ban that program, but I don't like it. But you're saying that statement on that date, at that time, was false, and it was demonstrably false. Therefore, here is a sanction. And I'm thinking particularly of Ofcom in the UK, the National Telecoms Regulator, which in terms of broadcast media only, if a member of the public believes that there is an instance of bias in a media broadcast, then they can actually complain to Ofcom, and Ofcom has a list of sanctions which they can impose just from a slap on the wrist to a warning to a fine. And that is used. People write into Ofcom with complaints, and Ofcom has criteria which are publicly set out that for issues of national political importance, and it defines how you work out if that issue is that way, then there has to be appropriate balance shown, and the balance has to have roughly equal time between the two opposing views, either within a program or across a series of programs. And if that is violated, then you have violated the Ofcom standards, and then you are liable to an Ofcom procedure. And with all of this, the standards themselves are an ideal, but what they give you is an objective criterion by which you can measure the accuracy of the outlet, and if they're violating those standards, there's something you can do about it. But you're doing it on the basis of the specific violation.
If there was a way of doing something about the violations on Russian media, that's really the question of how to deal with that. Because those standards, there's a project in Ukraine called Stop Fake, which does precisely that.
Yeah.
They track all the stories that appear on Russian media that are blatantly untrue, and they put them online. And so anybody who's interested can see where the false news is coming. But
who's interested?
That's actually not having any impact on stopping that flow of misinformation. So there's no mechanism. I guess part of what this panel is about, and you're next, is how do you deal with those distortions in an international context? In a domestic context, you can have a state regulator. But what do you do if it's international? How do you defend yourself? How do you fix the picture? How do you not censor, but hold accountable somebody who is presenting information that is untrue? So that's the question. So
in terms of the UK national, in terms of the UK national regulator, it regulates what is broadcast in the UK. It doesn't matter who's broadcasting it. If it's broadcast in the UK, then it is within their purview. The problem then becomes if it's an internet broadcast, but you could say that the bottom line is if you are broadcasting in my country, then within the borders of this country, it is my regulator which regulates it.
So that's
But
precisely.
then
So that's what Ukraine did.
yeah.
So you're
But
basically
what
saying
Ofcom
that
is doing is, rather than saying I am going to shut you down, is here is the particular transgression on the particular date. Here is the particular fine you've got to pay.
so they fine them.
So
rather than,
one of the, I mean, there's a whole sliding scale of sanctions, but it can lead up to a substantial fine. And if they are doing it regularly enough and blatantly enough, the fines add up. You are not shutting them down, but every time they do that, that is having a cost, and at some point that's going to become unsustainable for them.
We should
I mean,
propose
the big question is what you do about the internet, and what do you do?
Yeah.
we should
I'm
propose that to
throwing
the
that open.
Ukrainian government.
Should I answer the question?
Um,
Or
Very briefly, and then Vasid. Very
about
briefly.
financing. I think that ideally, we all can agree that there should be a public broadcaster supported by the public, supported local public broadcasters, supported by communities. That's ideal, and that's something every can reach out to afterwards to get at least to expect that there is going to be some kind of balance and unbiased information. But what to do in countries where it's not possible? It's not possible in Russia to establish public broadcaster at the moment or in the last 25 years. It's not possible to establish it in Ukraine. Even now, after the revolution, I know for sure that the government fights against, a lot of people in the government fights against establishing public broadcaster very hard. So it's not possible to do that either. So what you do instead, you set up something out of the system. So sometimes if the system is too corrupt or not functioning, you cannot reform it from inside. So we set up something outside system. And Hromadske, for example, is a good example where if the society understands that there is a need for a public broadcaster with unbiased view, the public will support it. Hromadske, despite being set up originally on international support grant money and so on, in last year, 65% of funds came from regular donations from the website. There is a lot of opportunity right now to expand to the same kind of crowd-funded system when it comes to Russian language. It's hard, but at the same time, what to do with countries where there is no public understanding of that there is a need for unbiased information, like in Russia. I'm not sure that the Russian public would support the idea of public broadcaster because they find with state broadcaster very well. So I think in that case, we don't have, unfortunately, any other way as to support internationally those refugee camps of international journalists, of investigative journalism, independent, and then with time, educate the population that they need something that is not internationally supported but locally supported. There is unfortunately not no other way. But we need to make those schemes of funding internationally those projects extremely transparent. Like we do, we have our finances are transparent. Everybody could find out how much money we get from whom. And also we make editorial process extremely transparent. So all editorial decisions, sometimes we even live stream our editorial meetings.
What's your audience, Maxim? How many people are actually watching you, international and Ukrainian audience?
Our audience locally...
rating, how many people are actually watching you?
I know that, for example, we are on so many platforms. So combined, it's, I think, in a couple of million people of reach, even bigger.
In Ukraine?
In Ukraine. And then with the international audience, half of people for international content comes from Ukraine, those people who work for embassies or international, but half comes from Russia, from states. Okay. And the reach there on social media sometimes with our most viral stuff is 700, 800,000 people. But the regular audience,
That's sizable.
but it's high quality audience. Again, we're not breaking news kind of news cycle agency.
On the regulation issue, last year I had an opportunity to attend a workshop which was organized by Legatum Institute and Atlantic Council in London. It was very sort of intimate environment of about 40 people or so from various governments actually, and as well as from media and think tanks, brainstorming for the whole day of how to actually, what to do with Russian disinformation. So we discussed various aspects of that inside out, and there was this issue about the regulation and actually what can publications subscribe to some sort of charter of good behavior. Sort of like there is in Britain, they have this investor in people, which companies, if they meet the requirements, they get this investor in people status. So they are doing quite good managing their human resources. So can publications create this sort of a special charter on the standards? And what if the journalists actually violate those standards? What is being done? I mean, it's very complicated, because at the end of the day, it's all about the fact-checking and good journalism. If it's not good journalism, then something has to be done. You know, that person has to be fired or something, or has to be warned. But still, nobody really came up. I mean, that was the best solution we could come up with, because at the end of the day, like here is an example of the story. So there is this journalist from The Guardian, Samuel Smil, who is now appointed as a spokesman of the Labour Party, right? If you read the articles of Samuel Smil, is it Russian disinformation? Or does he really believe in what he's writing? You know, that's the problem, because I think he believes in what he's writing. So yes, he is talking about this Soviet industrialization and how great the Soviet Union was and everybody was educated, etc. I think he just believes into that. Does he get some money from the Kremlin? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But now he is actually a key spokesman of the major party in Britain, right? So I guess his ideas will be the same. I mean, just like his bosses, right? And I'm okay. So how do we deal with that? I mean, are they useful idiots, or these people who go to Valdai, they appreciate the access to Vladimir Putin, they talk to him very intimately, and then yes, of course, they raise their voice, they talk. Yes, Russia has the right to have an interest, legitimate interest in Ukraine. And why is it legitimate? Yes, because it's been the Russian sphere of influence. And if you go into the academia in America and North America, you'll see lots of that. And this is, you're based in Canada, you need to do more there. You know, you're doing a lot, but look, talk to academia. I was in Harvard this summer.
All the time, my friend, trust me.
No, but look, I mean, this is like a pertinent issue. Academia in North America is very left-wing. So they are actually buying into what, you know, that Russia has the right, you know, because we have the right to do whatever, America has the right to do whatever they want, so Russia has the right to do whatever they want. So this is, you know, this is their thinking, and it's very dangerous, because you go to this, you know, to the established educational institutions in like Harvard or Georgetown or Tufts, and you see that, a lot of that, right?
I would agree with you, but only to a point. I would say academia is very divided, and there is a very strong section of intellectual thinking in North America and in Europe that is left-wing, anti-American, and they think in these terms. That the United States, they have their sphere of influence, and Russia has their sphere of influence, and that's their kind of mental framework in which they operate. And so all of this information that's coming, it gets placed into that pre-existing value system. And I think it's very similar that happens in media. That media reporting, whether it's biased or accurate, audiences are always active and interpreting according to their value systems. And this sort of gets back to one of your points, that I would be a little more optimistic about Russian audiences, even though you know much more about them than I do. Audiences everywhere are subjective and active. And most people, they don't have a whole lot of time and interest in investing, looking for information. They come home, they've been working all day, they turn on the news or the internet or the radio, they just want to know what the headlines were and what happened, and they use familiar sources, and they choose the sources that reflect the views that they share, they already hold. So that's a very normal pattern everywhere. I don't think that Russian audiences are different that way, but the question is, what do you do to somehow filter or push back against that deliberate manipulation that's happening? And that's the question that we're sort of dancing around it, but we're not really, I mean, your point about long-term investment and standards and all of that, but the situation Ukraine is in right now is, you know, you turn on the news and almost every day there's some sort of a lie about what's going on in Ukraine. So what do you do about that? And if you turn on some of these international Russian channels, it's the same thing on an international level. So what could be done? I mean, pushing back, I mean, your point about fining, I think that's a great idea. And I don't know if any other countries are doing this, because a lot of information in Russia today can be proven to be factually inaccurate. So is Britain, is Canada, is Germany are they finding these channels that are broadcasting this? What other ideas are there? So let's, I'm not sure how much time we have left because I've sort of lost track of time, but Sidhi and then everybody else who wants to jump in. Let's just kind of jump in and make it less formal.
I just wanted to correct that first on lies. You know, in I think 90% of the cases, finding out that what is presented as a fact is not a fact takes a minute. It's about people on all sides of political spectrum who do not have a habit of checking the sources, of being critical to what they read. And every day I see how educated people, young people on social networks, they share information that is dear to their heart without paying any attention what's the source and what's the contents of it. Right. So this is something probably to be fixed in educational systems to make people understand that this is probably one of the most important things they have to learn, and that is the thing that helps them in all sorts of affairs. It's, it doesn't matter what they actually do in life. They need to know how to do that, and they need to do that. And on different opinions. You know, I think it's perfectly okay to have all sorts of opinions in the society, and to have professors who are able to express these opinions and share them with their students. But first you have to have, well, different opinions then. And the second thing is that it's important where the mainstream goes. And the situation that we have today, the trouble of it, is that what's the mainstream in Russia is very marginal groups in other countries. And I think, well, if you ask me, I think it's quite correct that they are marginal in other countries, and we have a trouble in Russia, that the mainstream goes this way. And why it goes this way? Because of, again, the political system, how it works, and how people on the top of this political system adjusted the mainstream according to their vision and according to their political needs. So it's again about more about the development of Russia as a country, internal development, and less to what you can do from the outside.
Can
I agree with that, although Václav Havel just popped into my head as you were speaking. And to what degree is this the greengrocer just putting out that sign? And to what degree are people actually buying into what Putin is saying is the question I don't have an answer to, but that's what I constantly think about when I hear that, you know, all this population believes this and supports this. All we can see is the window dressing, and we don't really know what's going on.
Just see what President Klaus is saying right now, and you will understand that maybe Havel was not always right.
I went to that discussion. Very practical fix is actually the whole messy situation that we have with disinformation and people just filtering out content is an effect of internet, and especially social media, because people have an ability to filter according to their interest. And what we're dealing is, as President Obama said, with balkanization of media. Media sphere. But there is one practical fix, and it is happening on the market, and we should pay more attention to that and support it, is curated content inside social media projects like Facebook does with instant articles, Snapchat does with reaching out to young audience, but also to broader audience like they have on Facebook, curating news content inside, or Apple does with their news app, where in fact you have a community of journalists applying journalistic standards to all content available. So in the end, people responding very well when we're looking into statistics. They don't want to make those decisions by themselves because they're too busy. Their life is crazy right now. They don't want to sign up or like every account of every media they like. They want to have it in one place. And when they go to instant articles in Facebook, or to discover in Snapchat or other curated content, or Twitter is doing right now, trying to put.
Snapchat, can you explain?
What?
Snapchat, what is that?
It's another social media platform popular among very young
Because
people.
not many people probably know it.
Yes, but so what they do, they curate their content and make available high quality, and they check. So they would never put something that it outright lies or insane content there because it doesn't it doesn't check all the boxes with high quality journalists. And we should pay more attention to this. And it's investment not only in young people, because like in Facebook, every day Facebook has a huge audience of different ages, and it's very easy for them to reach out to even older audiences. So that's a very practical fix, and I think it's something we should support in its future, and it could get us out of this messy situation.
On the question of who's doing defining where, I'm honestly not sure. Something I know that within the UK you have a very fractured system where Ofcom is responsible for broadcasts which are not BBC, and then the BBC has its own board of governors which is responsible for the BBC content, but Ofcom will only respond to stuff which is actually broadcast and which was done within a certain period of time. So you can't go back and say I didn't like this program 2 years ago. So there's a very fragmentary system, and this is why I thought I would throw out there, I mean, I'm not sure of the ramifications of this, but if you were to have something on the EU level, at least you could have a less fragmentary structure, which is also less prone to manipulation by individual parties in individual countries. But I think the idea of decent journalists doing their job decently is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely.
And there are something which, coming back to this question of the fringes, it is a very good point that the Russian media are broadcasting into our countries, contacting our fringes, and they are using commentators from our fringes to validate their messages. So I did a fascinating study of one of the Russian channels' use of members of the European Parliament on EU stories, and they would and how many interviews they did with the whole of the European People's Party, which is like 35% of all MEPs together. It's the biggest grouping in Parliament, and how many they did just with the UK Independence Party. Yeah. And the EPP has 35% of the seats in Parliament, and it got about 5% of the interviews. UKIP has about 2% of the seats in Parliament and got 35% of the interviews. And you know, I put the graph together and just thought, whoa, mirror image. And it's, you know, it is them reaching out to our extremes, using our extremes as validators, but also supporting those extremes with coverage they wouldn't get otherwise. You know, Jeremy Corbyn's another case in point.
Yeah.
He got like 95% of all the coverage throughout, from the day he threw his hat into the ring till the day he was elected. He was like being pushed so much by them. And the other guys were kind of, oh yeah, some other people are running as well, but we don't care about them because they're not Stalinists. So there is this great attention to the fringe, but I think to inject a note of optimism, the more they do that, the more they're missing our mainstream. Actually, I mean, there's a point beyond which the mainstream is just going to say, "No, come on, that's just not."
That's a good point.
The more, if you are a French mainstream voter and you are watching RT in French or reading Sputnik in French, and you see that the only people they are quoting in French is the National Front.
Yeah.
Then where's your credibility? So to some extent, they are marginalizing themselves in our societies. Yeah. I mean, it's much more difficult in Ukraine, on which I don't even claim to be an expert, but certainly within our societies, there's so much focus on the extremes that I would suspect that they're actually sort of boxing themselves into that corner. You know, it's rebel TV. It's if you want to tear down the Union flag, go for it. But actually, if you quite like the Union, you think, come on.
Yeah, but at the same time, sometimes it actually goes into mainstream. For instance, in Greece, because Tsipras there, he is the prime minister who's been re-elected now again, and basically how I was in Greece a couple of weeks ago, and how Greek media works. They have the copy paste from Sputnik, the Greek version of the news, and they put it in their newspapers. And there is this fascination with this Greek-Russian friendship, which actually never existed.
Know,
but there is a myth. It's a myth
French.
because there was a relationship there, but it's always been for in the pragmatic interest of Moscow. It was never in the pragmatic interest of Greece, actually, because at a certain stage they just wanted to weaken the Ottoman Empire. At the second stage they wanted to keep Greece in part of this sort of Warsaw Pact, or you name it. I mean, and it didn't work out. And now all of a sudden, when there is a crisis in Greece, they all talk about this myth of friendship. They talk about this Orthodox friendship. But this is, look, 90% of Ukrainians are Orthodox. it didn't stop them, did it? So I mean, this is and now, sorry, I'll just finish. Like for instance, Putin, he put a stake on Germany. Germany is an interesting case, and Ben speaks German. He can probably also comment on that. He really wanted to distance Merkel from Obama. They invested so much resources into, you know, there was a big network there, you know, Raptly and Russia Today in Germany. I mean, they had many different outlets, media outlets in German language. They engaged heavily. You know, he was a spy there. They have a huge network in Germany of spies cultivating the Schroeder and all those guys into their Nord Stream projects, paying money here and there, you know, talking, you know, to the extreme Green Party, or not the Green Party, the left wing, the Link and whoever is there, and, you know, Social Democrats cultivating a relationship there. So they almost succeeded. I think they almost succeeded.
Well.
Oh, that scandal, remember, about tapped phone with Merkel? I do think they were there, and it almost worked.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, something happened.
Well, your point about pushed too far and then it comes back.
Exactly.
Just on this Greek case, and I think it has something to do with the story you told us earlier about your communist grandfather from Ternopil. So what comes first? The news that he gets, or the fact that he's communist and he
reads newspapers, these communist newspapers.
Yeah, I understand, but this is like food he prefers because he prefers this food. And you have groups of the society that do have, well, different opinion from the mainstream, and the group gets larger only under the circumstances when you have people dissatisfied. This is what happens in Greece. This is what happens in a number of regions of Ukraine. So people look for the alternative because they are not happy with what they have. And here you have a lot of work to do about the functionality of the state, about the effectiveness of the state structures. This is something we should keep an eye on.
If I can jump in at another hopeful point, because I feel like being optimistic. If you look at Syria, in many ways Syria has been a great success for Russia. You know, it's put them back on the stage. However, in terms of the propaganda, it was a total failure. Because what you had was, in the whole of the month of September, you had first Putin, then Lavrov, then Assad doing his interview with the Russian media, then Putin again at the UN General Assembly saying, we are joining this crusade against IS. And you had the head of the Russian Orthodox Church saying, yes, we are joining this holy war against IS. And it was IS, 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 IS. We need an international coalition against it. The day that Russia started dropping bombs and the Defense Ministry published its photos and its footage of here is us dropping bombs, within 2 hours you had online experts like Ruslan Leviev saying, well, hang on, your bomb was there and I've just geolocated your footage that it was there, and IS is over here, 600 miles away. And within the first day, Russia was going from here is us fighting against IS to, well, here is us fighting against IS and other terrorist groups. And there's all terrorists. There's no such thing as moderate terrorists. And the following day, you already had Ash Carter saying, look, they are not bombing IS. You know, we have no problem with Russia bombing IS, but they're not. And so on the first day, that propaganda offensive failed, and that was because you had people who already knew the truth. You had people like Ruslan Leviev, who had spent, and Elliot Higgins at Bellingcat, who'd spent 4 years studying the Syrian conflict and damn well knew the first names of every jihadist and every terrorist and every moderate in the country, and already knew how to geotag stuff. And so there is a point beyond which the propaganda just will not stick, and the more information people have already, you know, if I give you, have some water, it tastes of strawberries. If you've never drank water, you might think, well, it doesn't look much like strawberries, but I'll take your word for it, I'll give it a try. If you've drunk water, you know, water doesn't taste of strawberries. Well, so the more you can generate preemptive information, the more you can inform people about what the situation is, the harder it will then be to disinform them. And what's happening is that disinformation happens in a sphere of ignorance. If you don't know any better, then you could believe that all Ukrainians are fascists or all Latvians are fascists. As soon as you know more of the background, it's much harder to convince you. So again, you know, it's not just the honest reporting, but it's the spreading the information about the big context and what's actually happening. You're shrinking the space in which the disinformation can thrive.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful note to start wrapping up our conversation, that the best way to fight disinformation is with information and exposing the lies, let's be honest, with what actually is happening. And this is a strategy that I think a lot of journalists in Ukraine, a lot of activists, a lot of PR professionals, that's the strategy they've been taking. And I think slowly that's having an effect, because I've written about this. Initially, Putin's propaganda machine was very effective. And think back to the spring of 2014, that interim government period. A lot of Western media was writing about the rise of extreme right-wing fascism in Ukraine. And then after the election, where the extreme right-wing parties received this much of the vote, that just totally disappeared off the spectrum. So I'd like to give everybody 1 minute to wrap up, because we have, I think, 3 minutes left. So we started with you, so you'll have the last word on this. So, Ben Nemo?
I think you're absolutely right. The best tool against disinformation is information. And the more information you can put out there, and the more information you can surround the content with, the less likely that disinformation is to take hold.
Thank you. Dr. Utkin?
I'll say what matters also is the language. People do like to get the information in their language, and if you want to have different sources of information available to the people, you have to adjust that to their needs, to their interests, and to their language. And this is not an easy task actually from the outside, because the broadcast is controlled.
Thank you.
I think that disruption on the internet when it comes to news is terrific and creative and can get us so many terrific things. But also I think that we should come back to structuring discussions and professional discussions online for online journalists, trying to figure out how to get back to standards again, and how to follow them even online, even if people don't want to watch your product. It should be high quality still.
Thank you.
I just believe we have to be very creative. And as one of the speakers here mentioned, that this is a Tom and Jerry warfare, where you basically have a cat following the mouse, and the dog there is actually NATO, which is sleeping. So the cat trying to get the mouse without waking up the dog. But my question and my approach to this, we should be creative in terms of how do we communicate with people in Russia, how do we actually deal with counter-propaganda. Let's be creative, use humor, use cartoons, use different other channels of communication apart from independent journalists. I mean, it's all good, everything is good, but there has to be some innovative project. I really like this new sort of applications or new technological tools, because I think this is the future, and it's there. And it's good to hear and engage, of course, as Russians, in many like common Russians who understand what's going on. But the problem is that Russia is trying to undermine the trust towards media. So that's to the conventional media. And the problem is, so they are telling the world that, look, you cannot trust anyone because all the series, Peter Pomerantsev put it very well. Nothing is true, everything is possible. So I think this is like very good. And how to deal with that, I mean, it's a challenge, but I think we can handle that.
Thank you very much. I think ending on a creative note, let's all keep thinking creatively how to battle against disinformation. Thank you for watching, and invite you to the next coffee break discussion.